Okay, let's jump right into this. We are looking today at an incredibly dramatic, high stakes historical narrative. We're talking about a story that pits the visceral, literal violence of a tyrant king against the completely unbreakable cosmic theology of a mother and her 7 sons. This explainer is going to unpack the text of 2nd Maccabees 7. And, this isn't just some gruesome account of ancient martyrdom. It actually serves as one of the most absolutely crucial, foundational texts for the theology of bodily resurrection. It's this profound, ultimate clash between temporary earthly power and an eternal conviction. So, to really understand the stakes here, we first have to ground ourselves in the volatile period right before the Maccabean revolt. We're looking specifically around 167 BCE. This is when King Antiochus IV Epiphanes launched an extreme, brutal campaign to completely crush Jewish practices. I mean, he wasn't just conquering territory, he was attempting a systematic erasure of an entire people's ancestral laws and identity. This is that immediate explosive context that actually gives birth to the events we're about to see in 2 Maccabees 7. All right, let's get into the first part of the story, the king's cruel decree. The narrative violently kicks off when a mother and her 7 sons are arrested. The king himself personally orders them to eat pork, and to force them into compliance, they're subjected to brutal beatings with whips and scourges. So right out of the gate, we're thrust into this high-stakes standoff between an absolute monarch and a single family. But the really crucial thing to understand here is that this wasn't just about food, right? Eating the meat in this specific historical context was a literal test of submission to an oppressor. To eat the pork was to publicly renounce their identity, their god, and their laws. It was this forced symbol of total surrender to a king who was actively trying to erase their entire way of life. Well, the first brother immediately steps up. He speaks for the whole family and delivers this absolutely uncompromising line: "We are prepared to die rather than violate our ancestral laws." And after he utters this ultimate defiance, Antiochus just flies into a blind rage. The king orders an incredibly visceral mutilation. The brother's tongue is cut out, he's scalped, his extremities are severed, and he's literally fried alive in a pan while his family is forced to watch. Yet remarkably, instead of breaking, the mother and the remaining brothers actually encourage one another to die courageously, putting all their trust in God's compassion. Which brings us to the next massive theme here: defiance and bodily resurrection. As these earthly tortures escalate, the theological arguments of the martyrs become spectacularly profound. I mean, they aren't just suffering at this point, they're actively preaching. The second brother introduces what is honestly one of the clearest early articulations of resurrection hope. Right at the point of death, he looks at the king and basically argues that Antiochus can only take a temporary present life. But the king of the universe, which is how he refers to God, has the power to restore it to an everlasting renewal. He just completely flips the power dynamic on its head. And the theology deepens even further with the third brother. When he's ordered to present his tongue for torture, he doesn't fight back. He quickly puts it out and courageously stretches out his hands. And you have to look at his reasoning here. He declares that he received these bodily members from heaven, and he fully expects to receive them again. His astonishing courage illustrates that this resurrection hope isn't just about, some surviving immaterial soul floating around. It is a literal, tangible restoration of embodied life. It's so intense that even Antiochus's own attendants are shocked by his nerve. This completely brilliant moment illustrates the ultimate contrast in the text. The fourth son explicitly reserves the hope of resurrection for the faithful. He embraces dying by mortal hands so he can cherish the hope of being raised again by God. But then he points directly at Antiochus and condemns the persecutor, saying, "For you, there will be no resurrection to life." So resurrection is being presented here not as a universal guarantee for everyone, but as a specific reward for the faithful and a total denial of future existence for the wicked. Now, the narrative pivots a bit in part 3 as they start directly warning the oppressor. With the fifth and sixth brothers, they don't just state their hope for the future. They look this furious king dead in the eye and deliver a chilling warning about the absolute limits of his human power, establishing this really powerful theology of divine justice. The fifth brother tells Antiochus, "Look, your power is strictly temporary, and God has not abandoned Israel." The sixth brother adds a bit more nuance, acknowledging that the Jewish people are suffering as a form of temporary divine discipline for their own sins. But he warns the king, saying, "Do not deceive yourself." Antiochus is basically just a temporary instrument, and his ultimate fate will be a severe, absolutely inescapable punishment from God. And that leads us to section 4, The mother's theological courage. After watching 6 of her sons die these horrific deaths in a single day, the mother steps forward. The text praises her manly courage, which is a term that definitely reflects the gender rhetoric of the ancient author, and her guidance, in her ancestral language, forms the absolute theological center of this entire explainer. In this incredible speech, she tells her remaining sons, "I did not give you life and breath. The Creator who formed humanity will give life and breath back to you." She is directly linking the theology of creation to the theology of resurrection. Her argument is brilliantly logical, right? If God could create you from nothing in my womb once, proving he is the author of life, then he's for sure more than capable of restoring that life to you when you lose it for his laws. Okay, we are down to section 5, the final test. With only the youngest brother remaining, Antiochus realizes his brutal tactics are just failing miserably, so he completely changes strategy. We really have to ask here, will the youngest son break? Desperate for a win, the king abandons the torture instruments and instead brings out the bribes. He promises the young man immense wealth, positions of public power, and even the elite status of being his personal friend, if only he will abandon his ancestral laws. When the young man refuses, the king actually stoops so low as to beg the mother to persuade her last surviving child to save his own life. So Antiochus thinks he finally has an ally in a grieving mother. But in this breathtaking moment of defiance, the mother agrees to speak to her son, only to use their ancestral language, which of course Antiochus cannot understand, to completely subvert the king's request. She mocks the cruel king, literally calling him a butcher. She tells her son to look at heaven and earth, recognize God's creative power, and die faithfully, so that through God's mercy, she might receive all her sons back together. It is an unbelievable move. And the youngest son's climax is electric. Before his mother even finishes speaking, he boldly interrupts. He loudly refuses the king, declaring his allegiance strictly to the law of Moses. He delivers a final, scathing indictment of Antiochus, warning him of unavoidable judgment. Plus, he explicitly interprets his and his brother's deaths as suffering for Israel's sins, hoping that his final sacrifice is going to bring an end to God's anger against the nation. Furious at this sheer contempt, Antiochus tortures the youngest worst of all, but he dies completely faithful. Let's wrap up with section 6 by looking at the legacy and historical accuracy of the text. Now, when a story is this powerful, it tends to grow over the centuries. It's really crucial for us to separate the original, stark text of 2 Maccabees from the expanded myths and traditions that developed much later on. Later Jewish and Christian traditions kind of felt the need to embellish the original text. They gave the mother names like Hannah, Solomonia, Miriam, or Shmuni, and they totally invented these highly dramatic executions for her, claiming she was burned, beheaded, or even threw herself from a roof. But if we look at the original source of 2 Maccabees 7, she is famously unnamed, and her end is remarkably understated. The text respectfully and abruptly concludes with the simple, heavy fact that, last of all, the mother died after her sons. There's no melodramatic spectacle, just the quiet finality of a woman who saw her faithful duty through to the very end. The legacy of this unnamed mother and her 7 sons echoes loudly through history. Their story forces us to look at a profound question. How temporary is earthly power when faced with an unbreakable conviction and a hope that reaches beyond the grave? Antiochus had literally all the weapons, the wealth, and the authority, but he was entirely powerless against a family armed with the belief that the creator of the universe could and would put them back together again. It's a fascinating look at the very dawn of resurrection theology, and I hope this explainer has helped you see the incredible depth beneath this ancient text. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.